Please marry me. A rich rancher widow begs the poor mountain man for his hand. The church falls silent. Townsfolk gasp. But the drifter doesn't want her money. He asks for something no one expected, to bring an Apache orphan under her roof as kin. From that moment, whispers spread like wildfire. A widow's fortune. A mountain man's shame. A child the town refuses to claim. And just as hope sparks, a railroad man rides in with papers that could strip them of everything: land, freedom, even family. Smoke rises, a barn burns, and a gunman with a grudge waits in the shadows. In a world where law bends to the rich and prejudice runs deep, one question tears through the dust and fire. Will love and faith be enough to save them, or will the price of "please marry me" be more than they can bear? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun slanted through the church windows, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floorboards. Mary Beth Calloway sat straight-backed in her usual pew, her black silk dress a stark contrast to the cheerful light. Her gloved hands lay folded in her lap, but beneath the careful stillness, they trembled slightly. Around her, the small congregation of the Foothills Church settled into their usual places. Ranch wives smoothed their best cotton dresses while their husbands tugged at tight Sunday collars. A few miners sat near the back, their faces scrubbed pink but their fingernails still rimmed with stubborn coal dust. Mr. Peterson, the general store owner, nodded to her as he passed, his wife Sarah clutching their family Bible. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and old hymnals filled the air, but Mary Beth barely noticed them. Her heart thundered in her chest as Reverend Thompson stepped up to the pulpit. She'd hardly heard a word of his sermon, her mind racing with what she meant to do, what she had to do. The service seemed both endless and too quick. Before she knew it, the final hymn was fading away. Just then, a movement at the back of the church caught her eye. Gideon Hale had slipped in, as quiet as a shadow. He stood against the wall, his tall frame looking out of place in the neat church interior. His buckskins were clean, but patched, his dark hair slightly too long by town standards. He kept his eyes down, as if trying to avoid notice. Mary Beth's throat tightened. She'd known he would come. He never missed a Sunday service, though he always arrived late and left early, keeping to himself. The sight of him strengthened her resolve. As the congregation began to rise, gathering their things to leave, Mary Beth stood. Her legs felt wooden, but her voice rang out clear and strong. "Please, if you would all stay a moment." The rustling and murmuring stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. She saw surprise, curiosity, and concern in their faces. Widow Calloway, always so proper and reserved, calling out in church? She stepped into the center aisle, her skirts whispering against the floorboards. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, pulled back severely in its widow's knot. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Gideon. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed church, "I have something to ask you." Gideon's head came up slowly. His weathered face revealed nothing but his eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, met hers steadily. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, rough from disuse. Mary Beth clasped her hands together to stop their shaking. "I find myself in need of help, Mr. Hale. The Calloway Ranch is too much for me to manage alone." A rustle of whispers swept through the church. Everyone knew the Calloway spread was the largest in the county, running cattle across thousands of acres of prime grazing land. Since Thomas Calloway's death 6 months ago, Mary Beth had struggled to keep it going, though she'd never admitted it until now. "I've watched you these past months," she continued. "I've seen how you work, how you treat others, how you help those in need without asking anything in return." She took a deep breath. "I would consider it an honor, Mr. Hale, if you would consent to marry me." The whispers exploded into shocked exclamations. Sarah Peterson's prayer book clattered to the floor. Someone gasped audibly. Reverend Thompson stepped forward, his face concerned, but Mary Beth held up a hand to stop him. Her eyes never left Gideon's face. He hadn't moved, but something flickered in his expression. Surprise, uncertainty, and something else she couldn't name. "Mrs. Calloway," he said carefully, "you don't know what you're asking. I'm not the kind of man." "I know exactly what I'm asking," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I'm asking for a partner. Someone who understands hard work and honest dealing. Someone who won't be afraid to face the challenges of running a ranch this size." She took a step closer to him, aware of but ignoring the scandalized looks from the congregation. "I'm offering a fair trade, Mr. Hale. Marriage and a share in the ranch, in exchange for your help in running it." The silence in the church grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary Beth could feel the judgment radiating from some of the townsfolk. A wealthy widow proposing to a poor mountain man, and in church no less. But she also saw understanding in some faces. They knew how hard it was to keep a ranch going alone. Gideon studied her for a long moment. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were troubled. Finally, he straightened from his slouch against the wall. "If I were to accept," he said slowly, "I'd have one condition." Another murmur ran through the church. Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife, actually snorted in disbelief. A man like Gideon Hale, putting conditions on a match so far above his station. But Mary Beth merely nodded. "Name it." "There's a boy," Gideon said, his voice softening slightly. "Mateo. His mother was Apache, his father Mexican. Both gone now. He's been staying with me these past few months, learning tracking and trapping." He paused, then continued firmly. "He comes with me. As family." Understanding dawned in Mary Beth's face. She'd heard rumors about the half-Apache boy living in Gideon's cabin, but she'd never seen him. Now she realized why Gideon had been taking extra trapping jobs, why he looked more worn than usual. He'd been providing for two. The congregation's reaction was immediate and heated. Taking in a mixed-blood child? The idea seemed to scandalize them even more than the improper proposal. Several people began speaking at once, their voices sharp with disapproval. But Mary Beth lifted her voice above them all. "How old is he?" 12, Gideon answered. "He's a good boy. Quick to learn, hardworking. But he needs a proper home, schooling." "Then he'll have it," Mary Beth said firmly. "The ranch has plenty of room, and I was a teacher before I married Thomas. I can see to his education myself." She turned to face the congregation, her spine straight as steel. "My husband, my late husband, believed that all God's children deserve a chance to make something of themselves. I share that belief." Her voice took on an edge of challenge. "Does anyone here disagree?" No one quite met her eyes. Even Mrs. Miller looked away, though her lips remained pinched with disapproval. Mary Beth turned back to Gideon. "Your condition is accepted, Mr. Hale. Now what is your answer?" The mountain man's face softened almost imperceptibly. Something like respect, and perhaps something more, flickered in his eyes. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps that echoed in the silent church. "Yes, Mrs. Calloway," he said quietly, "I accept." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with promise and possibility. Mary Beth felt her shoulders relax slightly, though she knew this was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, the townsfolk's disapproval, the hard work of melding two very different lives, the complexities of creating a family from such unlikely pieces. But as she looked up into Gideon's steady blue eyes, she saw the same determination she felt in her own heart. Whatever came, they would face it together. The congregation buzzed with shocked conversations. Reverend Thompson cleared his throat, clearly unsure whether to offer congratulations or objections. But before he could speak, the church door creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright sunlight. A small figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, a boy, thin but straight-backed, with dark eyes that took in the scene warily. "Mateo, come looking for Gideon." The boy hesitated on the threshold, sensing the tension in the air. Gideon turned slightly, holding out his hand. "Come in, son," he said, his voice gentler than anyone in town had ever heard it. "There's someone I want you to meet." The gentle invitation, the way Gideon's face softened when he looked at the boy, these things told Mary Beth more about the man she'd just agreed to marry than any words could have done. As Mateo walked slowly down the aisle to join them, She sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the courage to follow her heart, even in the face of scandal and disapproval. For in that moment, watching Gideon welcome the boy with quiet dignity, she knew she'd made the right choice, not just for the ranch, but for all three of them. The church fell as silent as a winter morning after Gideon made his request. Mary Beth could hear the old floorboards creaking beneath her feet as she stood there, her heart beating fast beneath her black silk bodice. Through the church's wavy glass windows, she caught sight of a small figure sitting in Gideon's wagon, waiting patiently in the bright morning sun. An Apache boy. Mrs. Miller's scandalized whisper cut through the silence like a knife. In a Christian household? Other voices joined in, a rising tide of disapproval that echoed off the whitewashed walls. Gone plumb mad with grief, poor thing. Guess Thomas Calloway would never have allowed it, sir. That boy'll bring nothing but trouble. Mary Beth lifted her chin, turning slowly to face the congregation. These were her neighbors, people she'd known for years, people who'd brought food when Thomas died, who'd offered sympathy and prayers. But now their familiar faces were twisted with prejudice and fear. She looked back at Gideon, studying him with new eyes. He stood straight and tall, his patched buckskins out of place among the Sunday finery, but there was nothing submissive in his bearing. His blue eyes met hers steadily, waiting for her answer. In that moment, she saw beyond his rough exterior to the heart of him, a man who would make a condition not for himself, but for a child who needed protection. "The boy," she said softly. "Mateo. Tell me about him." Gideon's weathered face softened slightly. His mama died of fever 2 winters back. His pa, a Mexican trader, got killed in a rock slide last spring. Boy's been staying with me since then. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's smart, ma'am. Learns quick. Good with animals. Just needs a chance, is all." Through the window, Mary Beth watched as Mateo climbed down from the wagon to give water to the horses. His movements were sure and gentle, his small hands competent on the reins. Despite his ragged clothes, he carried himself with a dignity that reminded her of the Apache elders she'd seen in town, proud and straight-backed even in the face of contempt. "Mad," someone muttered, "completely mad." But Mary Beth wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering Thomas's words, spoken so often during their 15 years together. "The good Lord didn't put us here to judge, Beth. He put us here to help." "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "Yes, Mateo will be welcome in my home, as family." Pastor Birch stepped forward, wringing his hands. "Mrs. Calloway, perhaps we should take some time to consider." "No." Mary Beth's tone was firm. "If Mr. Hale is willing to marry me today, I'd like you to perform the ceremony now, Pastor." The minister looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Mary Beth's determined face and the muttering congregation. "Well, I suppose, if you're certain." "I am." She turned to Gideon. "If you are." He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. "I am." The ceremony was brief and stark, nothing like the celebration that had marked Mary Beth's first wedding. No flowers decorated the altar, no music filled the air. Only the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and the disapproving whispers of the congregation witnessed their vows. When it was done, Mary Beth walked down the aisle on Gideon's arm, her head held high. Outside, Mateo had finished watering the horses and stood waiting, his dark eyes wary as they approached. "Mateo," Gideon said quietly, "this is Mrs. Anton Calloway. She's agreed to give us a home." The boy looked up at Mary Beth, his face carefully blank, but she saw how his fingers twisted in the hem of his worn shirt, betraying his nervousness. "Hello, Mateo," she said gently. "I'm very pleased to meet you." He nodded politely but didn't speak. Mary Beth saw how he positioned himself slightly behind Gideon, like a shadow seeking shelter. The townsfolk were emerging from the church now, gathering on porches and in doorways to watch. Their stares felt heavy as lead on Mary Beth's back as Gideon helped her into the wagon. Mateo climbed up after them, settling in the back with fluid grace. The ride to the ranch was silent except for the creak of leather and the steady clip of hooves on the packed earth road. Mary Beth's mind raced with all that needed to be done: a room prepared for Mateo, clothes to be bought, arrangements to be made. But underneath the practical concerns ran a current of uncertainty. What had she done? How could she make this work? The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch house, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The familiar white-painted walls and wide porch looked different somehow, as if the home she'd shared with Thomas had transformed into something new and unknown. "I'll see to the horses," Gideon said quietly, helping her down from the wagon. Mary Beth nodded. "Supper will be ready soon." She turned to Mateo, who was climbing down on his own. "Would you like to wash up first? There's a pump in the kitchen." The boy glanced at Gideon, who gave him an encouraging nod. Without a word, Mateo followed Mary Beth into the house. The kitchen was warm and clean, smelling of the bread she'd baked that morning. Mary Beth showed Mateo how to work the pump, then busied herself with preparing the meal while he washed his hands and face. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as if he was performing a ritual rather than a simple task. By the time Gideon came in from the barn, she had set the table with her everyday dishes, 3 plates where there had been only 1 for so many months. The lamplight caught the edges of the china, casting soft shadows on the white tablecloth. They sat down together, this strange new family. Gideon bowed his head. "Lord," he said quietly, "thank you for this food and for bringing us together under this roof. Help us to be worthy of your blessings." "Amen." Mary Beth echoed the amen, noticing how Mateo watched everything with those serious dark eyes, learning the ways of his new home. He ate politely but sparingly, his table manners surprisingly refined for a boy who had been living in a trapper's cabin. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet clink of forks against plates and the tick of the clock on the mantel. So many things needed to be said. So many questions needed to be asked. But for now they simply shared this first meal together, 3 souls brought together by necessity and hope, while the lamp flickered gently in the gathering dark. The ranch kitchen, once so familiar to Mary Beth, felt different now. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, the silence more profound. Yet as she watched Gideon carefully cut his meat and saw how Mateo's tense shoulders gradually relaxed, she felt something else too. The first tentative stirring of possibility, like a seedling pushing through spring soil. They were strangers yet, bound together by desperate choices and solemn vows. But as the evening deepened around them, and the lamp cast its gentle glow over their faces, Mary Beth found herself believing that perhaps with time and patience, they might grow into something more. Something like a family. The pale dawn light crept across Mary Beth's quilt as she opened her eyes. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of movement downstairs, the creak of floorboards, the opening and closing of the back door. After 15 years of waking to silence, the noises startled her fully awake. She dressed quickly in a simple work dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons as she heard the rhythmic thunk of an axe outside. From her bedroom window, she could see Gideon in the yard, already hard at work. He had stripped to the waist despite the morning frost, his powerful shoulders flexing as he swung the axe. Though his clothes were patched and worn, his movements showed the fluid efficiency of a man who knew his trade. Near the chicken coop, Mateo scattered feed in careful circles, his small figure dwarfed by Gideon's borrowed coat. The boy moved with the same quiet purpose she'd noticed yesterday, following some pattern Gideon must have shown him. Mary Beth hurried downstairs to the kitchen, where the cook stove still held some warmth from whenever Gideon had lit it. She added more wood, set coffee to brew, and found herself watching through the window as Gideon instructed Mateo on gathering eggs. The boy listened intently, nodding at each direction, his face serious with concentration. When the coffee was ready, she poured 3 cups and carried them outside on a tray. The morning air bit at her cheeks, and frost crunched under her boots. "Mr. Hale," she called softly, "I've brought coffee." Gideon paused mid-swing, lowering the axe. Sweat gleamed on his chest despite the cold. "Much obliged, ma'am." He reached for his shirt, hanging on the woodpile. "Please call me Mary Beth," she said, setting the tray on a stump. "We are married now, after all." A ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. "Mary Beth, then." He pulled on his shirt and took a cup, his rough hands careful with the delicate china. "Mateo," he called. "Come get your coffee, son." The boy approached cautiously, accepting his cup with a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am." "You're welcome, Mateo." Mary Beth wrapped her hands around her own cup, grateful for its warmth. I see you've been helping with chores already. Mateo nodded. Gideon showed me how to feed the chickens proper so they don't waste none of the grain. He's a quick study, Gideon said, pride warming his voice. Shows him once he remembers. Mary Beth watched as color touched the boy's cheeks at the praise. I'll need to go to town today for supplies, she said. Would you like to come along, Mateo? We can get you some new clothes. Mateo glanced at Gideon, who nodded. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I'll keep at the wood, Gideon said. Ranch this size, you must go through a fair amount in winter. We usually hire men for that, Mary Beth began, then stopped as something flickered in Gideon's eyes. But I appreciate you taking care of it yourself. He nodded, already turning back to his work. Mary Beth found herself studying the precise way he positioned each log, the clean efficiency of his movements. This was not a man who relied on others to do his work for him. After breakfast, Mary Beth hitched up the wagon while Mateo helped clean the kitchen, with the same careful attention he gave every task. The drive to town was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Mateo sat straight beside her, taking in everything with those observant eyes. The general store's bell chimed as they entered. Mr. Peterson hurried forward, his usual unctuous smile in place. Mrs. Calloway, what a pleasure to see you this morning. Good morning, Mr. Peterson. I need quite a few things today. She began listing supplies while Mateo stood quietly beside her, his eyes drawn to the candy jars on the counter. Of course. Peterson began gathering items, his manner perfectly cordial, until he noticed Mateo reaching for a piece of penny candy. His face darkened. Here now, boy. Don't be touching what you can't pay for. Mateo snatched his hand back as if burned. Mary Beth felt anger rise in her throat like bile. Mateo is my son now, Mr. Peterson, she said clearly, her voice carrying through the store. And he is welcome to any candy he would like. Peterson's face reddened. Mrs. Calloway, surely you don't mean to say that this Indian boy... I mean to say exactly that. Mary Beth's spine straightened. Mateo is my son by choice, and he will be treated with respect in this establishment. Now, I would like 1 pound of those candies, please. The peppermint ones that Mateo was admiring. The storekeeper opened and closed his mouth, clearly torn between his prejudice and the prospect of losing his wealthiest customer. Finally, he turned to measure out the candy, his movements stiff with disapproval. Mary Beth felt a small hand slip into hers. Looking down, she met Mateo's dark eyes, filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. She squeezed his fingers gently. The ride home was quieter still, but now and then Mateo would reach into the paper bag of candy, carefully selecting a piece. Each time, he would break it in half, offering 1 portion to Mary Beth before eating his own share. When they arrived home, they found Gideon had split enough wood to fill the woodshed twice over. He was in the barn now, examining the tools with a critical eye. Needs sharpening, he said when Mary Beth found him. Handled wrong too long. She nodded, remembering how Thomas had always said the same. The hired men never quite cared for things properly. You'll find what you need in the tack room. That evening, as Mary Beth lit the lamps and began serving supper, she noticed how different the kitchen felt. The bread was the same recipe she'd always used, the plates set in their usual places, but something had shifted. Perhaps it was the way Gideon pulled out her chair before seating himself, or how Mateo carefully arranged his napkin in his lap, copying her movements. Ma'am, Mateo said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. For today. At the store. Mary Beth's throat tightened. You're very welcome, Mateo. And you can call me Mary Beth if you'd like. Or, she hesitated, then continued softly, whatever feels right to you. The boy nodded, studying his plate, but she saw how his shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. After the dishes were done, Mary Beth found herself reaching for Thomas's Bible, worn smooth by years of daily reading. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, remembering all the evenings she'd spent listening to her first husband's deep voice sharing these passages. Would you like to hear a chapter, she asked, looking at Gideon and Mateo. Gideon nodded, settling into Thomas's old chair by the fire. Mateo sat cross-legged on the rug, his face turned up expectantly. Mary Beth began to read, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger. The familiar words filled the room, speaking of love and mercy, of strangers becoming family, of hope blooming in desert places. As she read, she couldn't help wondering, had she invited ruin into her home, marrying a poor trapper and taking in an Apache child? Or was this God's providence, bringing them together in their need? The lamplight caught the silver threading through Gideon's dark hair, softened the tired lines around his eyes. It turned Mateo's face golden, making him look for a moment like one of the cherubs in her mother's old Bible. Both of them listened intently, their faces peaceful in the gentle light. Perhaps Mary Beth thought providence and ruin weren't so far apart after all. Perhaps sometimes you had to risk one to find the other. She turned the page, her voice steady now as she continued reading into the quiet evening, while outside the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. 2 weeks passed like water flowing in the creek behind the ranch house. The bitter Colorado winter settled in deeper, bringing short days and long nights filled with howling wind. Yet inside the ranch house, warmth bloomed, not just from the constantly fed wood stove, but from the slow weaving together of 3 separate lives into something new. Morning frost painted the windows as Mary Beth watched Gideon demonstrate how to check leather reins for wear. His weathered hands moved with practiced care over each strip of tack, showing her where to look for dangerous thinning. "See here?" He pointed to a crack forming near a buckle. "Catch it early, save yourself trouble later. Might save your life too if it gives way at the wrong moment." Mary Beth leaned closer, breathing in the familiar smell of leather oil and hay. "I always left this to the hired hands before." "Best to know yourself," Gideon said quietly. "Can't always count on having help." She nodded, remembering how alone she'd felt after Thomas died, surrounded by workers who saw her as nothing but a wealthy widow to be managed. "Show me again?" A ghost of a smile touched Gideon's face as he guided her hands over the leather. "Feel that rough spot? That's where you start." From the corner of the barn came the sound of Mateo mucking out stalls, his movements quick and efficient. He'd taken to the ranch work like he'd been born to it, anticipating needs before they were spoken. Later that morning, Gideon took Mary Beth out to the winter pasture where the cattle huddled against the cold. He showed her how to read their movements, how to turn the herd without spooking them. "You've got a good seat," he commented as she guided her horse alongside his. "Just need to trust yourself more." "Thomas taught me to ride," she said, "but he never let me work the cattle. Said it wasn't proper." Gideon was quiet for a moment, watching a cow and calf picking through the snow for grass. "Proper don't feed people," he finally said. "Work does." By afternoon, they were back in the warm kitchen. Mary Beth sat at the table with Mateo, one of Thomas's old books open between them. The boy's finger traced carefully under each word as he read aloud. "The mountain stood tall and he worked out slowly." "That's right," Mary Beth encouraged. "Sound it out just like we practiced." Mateo's face was intent with concentration. He'd picked up letters quickly, hungry for knowledge in a way that made her heart ache. How long had he wanted to learn? The sharp rap of knuckles on the front door startled them all. Gideon's hand went instinctively to his belt knife before he caught himself. Mary Beth smoothed her apron and went to answer. On the porch stood Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, along with 3 other ladies from town. Their Sunday best looked out of place against the working ranch backdrop. "Why, Mrs. Calloway," Mrs. Henderson's voice was bright with false warmth. "We were just passing by and thought we'd pay a neighborly call. If it's not inconvenient?" Mary Beth kept her face pleasant, though her stomach tightened. No one just passed by a ranch 5 miles from town in winter. "Of course not. Please, come in out of the cold." She led them to the parlor where they arranged themselves like colorful birds on her furniture, examining everything with sharp eyes. Mary Beth excused herself to fetch coffee and heard Mrs. Henderson's carrying whisper, "Well, at least she's keeping the house decent." When she returned with the coffee tray, Gideon had taken up position by the fireplace, standing silent and watchful. Mateo had disappeared, though she suspected he was listening from the kitchen. "Such a surprise, your sudden marriage," Mrs. Peterson said, accepting a cup. "Though of course we understand. A woman alone." "Yes," added Mrs. Henderson. "Though surely there were more suitable candidates in town? The minister's brother, for instance." "I chose exactly who I wanted," Mary Beth said firmly, pouring more coffee. Mrs. Williams leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But dear, to take in an Indian child? What will people think? There's that fine school in Denver where they take such children, teach them proper ways. Mary Beth's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Mateo is my son now, she said clearly. He has a home here, and a family. But surely you see the impropriety, Mrs. Henderson pressed. Indian blood under a respectable roof? The talk in town. Those who sit at my table, Mary Beth cut in, her voice gentle but steel strong, will treat all members of my family with respect. Those who cannot do so need not return. A shocked silence fell. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed dark red. The other ladies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Gideon hadn't moved from his place by the fire, but his eyes held approval as he watched Mary Beth. His jaw was tight, hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent. The visit didn't last much longer after that. The ladies made their excuses and departed in a flutter of skirts and barely concealed offense. As the door closed behind them, Mary Beth sagged against it, suddenly exhausted. "Mama!" Mateo's small voice came from the kitchen doorway. It was the first time he'd called her that, and her heart caught in her throat. She turned to find him standing there, his dark eyes full of questions. "Will they always hate me?" "Oh, sweetheart." Mary Beth crossed to him in 3 quick steps, gathering him close. He stiffened for a moment, then melted into her embrace. "No, they don't understand yet, but they will. And even if they don't, you are wanted here. You are loved here. Never doubt that." She felt him nod against her shoulder, his thin arms tightening around her waist. Over his head, she met Gideon's eyes. Her husband's face was shadowed with something like pain or memory. That evening, after Mateo had gone to bed, Gideon sat by the fire with his knife and whetstone. The steady scraping sound filled the room as Mary Beth darned socks by lamplight. "Won't let them hurt him," Gideon said suddenly, his voice rough, "and neither of you. Even if they're neighbors." Mary Beth looked up from her mending. Gideon's face was cast in sharp relief by the firelight, his hands never stopping their rhythmic movement across the blade. "I know," she said softly. "Killed a man once," he continued, eyes fixed on his work. "In a brawl. He pulled a knife first, but that don't make it right. Been running from it ever since." He paused, the whetstone still. "Won't run no more, though." "Got something worth standing for now?" Mary Beth set down her darning and crossed to him, laying a hand on his shoulder. She felt the tension in him, the years of solitude and shame. "We all have things we're running from," she said, "but maybe God brings us together so we can learn to stand still." Gideon's free hand came up to cover hers, rough and warm. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady in the darkness. But inside, the fire burned bright, holding the cold at bay. The spring thaw came slowly to the Colorado foothills that year. March winds stirred winter brittle grass as patches of earth emerged from beneath the melting snow. The creek that marked the ranch's eastern boundary swelled with snowmelt, its waters turning muddy and swift. Mary Beth stood beside Gideon at the north pasture fence line, her boots sinking into the soft ground. The winter had changed her. Her hands were no longer soft, and her movements showed the confidence of honest work. She held the fence post steady while Gideon drove it deeper with measured strikes of the post maul. "Ground still frozen underneath," he said, pausing to wipe his brow. "But it'll hold?" She nodded, scanning the valley that stretched before them. The late morning sun caught the rivulets of spring runoff threading down the hillsides. This land had been her home for 15 years, ever since Thomas brought her here as a bride. Now it felt more precious than ever. Movement caught her eye. Figures walking the far ridge, stopping now and then to peer through some kind of instrument on a tripod. "Gideon," she said quietly, "look there." He straightened, following her gaze. His expression darkened as he watched the surveyor's work. "Railroad men," he said. "Seen their kind before." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A well-dressed man rode toward them on a sleek bay horse, his suit marking him as a city dweller. He removed his hat as he reached them, revealing carefully combed hair and a practiced smile. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was smooth as creekstones. "I'm Richard Lowell from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad office. He produced a card from his vest pocket. "I wonder if I might have a word?" Mary Beth felt Gideon shift closer to her side, his presence solid and protective. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Lowell?" The agent's smile didn't waver as he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather folder. "Just some routine business regarding the planned spur line. I have here an agreement signed by your late husband, granting the railroad right-of-way through this valley." The words hit Mary Beth like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Thomas never mentioned selling any rights to the railroad." "Nevertheless, madam." Lowell held out several papers, their official seals glinting in the sun. "The documentation is quite clear. The railroad purchased access to this valley for the new line. Surely you were aware." "I handled all our business affairs alongside my husband," Mary Beth said firmly, though her heart was racing. He would have discussed something this important. The agent's smile took on a patronizing edge. "Ah, well, widows often misplace papers in their grief. Perfectly understandable." He tucked the documents away. "But I assure you, everything is quite in order. We'll begin preliminary work soon. Surveying, clearing, that sort of thing. I'm simply extending the courtesy of informing you." Gideon's voice was low and dangerous. "Show those papers again." Lowell's expression cooled. "I think not. If Mrs. Calloway wishes to dispute the railroad's claim, she can do so through proper legal channels." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good day to you both." "Mr. Lowell," Gideon stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his belt knife. "I believe it's time for you to leave this property." The agent's face tightened, but he gathered his reins. "As you wish. But do remember, progress cannot be stopped, no matter how much some might wish to cling to the past." He touched his heels to his horse's flanks, turning back toward town. Mary Beth watched him go, her thoughts whirling. "Thomas wouldn't have done this," she said. "He loved this land. He wouldn't have sold it away without telling me." Gideon's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Best start with his papers." That evening, after supper was cleared away, Mary Beth sat at Thomas's old desk in the study. She'd pulled out every drawer, spreading ledgers and documents across the surface. Her fingers traced familiar columns of numbers: cattle counts, supply purchases, wages paid to hands. But nothing about the railroad. Mateo appeared in the doorway, watching her with solemn eyes. "What are you looking for?" She managed a smile, though worry gnawed at her stomach. "Just some old papers, sweetheart. Nothing to fret about." He came closer, touching one of the ledgers with careful fingers. In the month since winter, he'd improved greatly at his reading. "These are about the ranch?" Yes, she pulled him close, drawing comfort from his presence. "Your father, Thomas, he kept careful records of everything." "Except the railroad papers," Mateo said quietly. Mary Beth's heart clenched. Of course he'd overheard. Children always did. "Did you see those men today?" He nodded. "Will we have to leave?" "No." She turned to face him fully, taking his small hands in hers. "This is our home. Yours and mine and Gideon's. I promise you that." But later, after Mateo had gone to bed, she stood at the window of her bedroom, staring out at the moonlit valley. The sound of Gideon's boots on the stairs told her he'd finished his evening check of the barn. "Found anything?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. She shook her head. "Nothing. Not a single mention of any deal with the railroad." Her hands clenched the windowsill. "Thomas kept everything. Receipts for penny nails, notes about which cow had a calf in which year. He wouldn't have hidden something this important." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Railroad men," he said finally, "they're like coyotes. Always testing for weakness, looking for a way in." He turned to face her. "But they ain't counting on you having teeth of your own this time." She met his eyes, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I won't let them take this land. Not from us. Not from Mateo." A distant whistle sounded then, echoing up the valley. The evening train from Denver, passing through on the main line miles away. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a harbinger of changes bearing down on them like a locomotive under full steam. Mary Beth shivered, and Gideon's arm came around her shoulders. Together they stood at the window, watching the moon cast shadows across the land they called home, while far away, the train whistle faded into the night. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Mary Beth hitched the wagon while Gideon saddled his horse, both of them moving with purposeful haste. They had to reach the county clerk's office before the morning stage brought more people needing records searched. "I'll mind things here," Mateo said from the porch, his shoulders straight with responsibility. "Got the chicken feed ready and wood chopped for the stove." Mary Beth paused to hug him, breathing in the clean scent of soap from his freshly washed hair. "We'll be back before dark, sweetheart. There's stew in the pot for your dinner if we're late." The boy nodded solemnly. In the months since winter, he'd grown taller, his face losing some of its wariness. "I'll practice my fiddle too," he added, "getting better at that song in the book." "That's fine," Gideon said, checking his cinch one last time. "Just mind you do your other chores first." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, Gideon riding alongside the wagon. The spring morning was crisp, their breath forming clouds in the air. Fields that had lain dormant all winter showed the first hints of green, and meadowlarks called from fence posts as they passed. "Thomas kept copies of everything," Mary Beth said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Even letters from his mother back east. If he'd sold rights to the railroad, there'd be some record." Gideon's expression was thoughtful. "Maybe that's what the railroad's counting on. Your word against theirs, with nothing solid either way." The town came into view around mid-morning, shop windows gleaming in the sun. A few people nodded as they passed, but others turned away. Mary Beth held her head high, though her heart ached at the changed greetings. Once she'd been welcomed warmly everywhere in town. Now her choices had marked her as different. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of the courthouse, a square brick building with tall windows. Inside, the air smelled of dust and ink and old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound record books and stacked documents. The clerk, Mr. Peterson, peered at them over wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers, who'd served in his position for 20 years. "Mrs. Calloway," he said carefully, "what brings you to my office today?" "We need to search the deed records," Mary Beth said. "Everything concerning the Calloway Ranch for the past 5 years?" Peterson's eyebrows rose. "The railroad business, I assume?" "Word travels fast in our little town." He stood, moving to the shelves. "Let me see what I can find." Hours passed as they combed through the records. Mary Beth's eyes grew tired from reading cramped handwriting, but she pressed on. Gideon helped, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile pages. They found the original deed, property tax records, even water rights documentation, but nothing about any transfer to the railroad. "That's everything we have on file," Peterson said finally. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Mrs. Calloway, I should mention, there's been talk. The railroad has powerful lawyers. They say that without a recent refiling of your deed, your claim might be vulnerable." Mary Beth's hands clenched in her skirts. "What do you mean, refiling?" The clerk spread his hands. "New territorial law requires property claims to be updated every 10 years. Your late husband's original filing was 12 years ago. Without a current record, he trailed off significantly." "That's theft by paper," Gideon said quietly, "legal robbery." "I simply report the facts," Peterson replied. "But if I were you, Mrs. Calloway, I'd consider securing proper legal counsel. Soon." They left the courthouse as afternoon shadows lengthened across the street. Mary Beth's head ached from strain and worry. "All those years," she said as Gideon helped her into the wagon. "All those careful records Thomas kept. And now they mean nothing because of some new law we never even knew about." "Law's just words on paper," Gideon said, swinging onto his horse. "Don't make it right." The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought as the sun sank toward the mountains. They crossed the creek just as dusk was settling in, the water running high and fast with snowmelt. Lamplight gleamed from the kitchen windows, welcoming them home. As they approached the house, another sound reached them, halting but sweet, the notes of a fiddle tune drifting through the evening air. Mary Beth's breath caught. The melody was one Thomas used to play on Sunday afternoons, his strong hands drawing music from the strings while she baked bread or darned socks. They entered quietly. Mateo sat in the kitchen, Thomas's old fiddle tucked under his chin. His face was tight with concentration as he worked through the tune, following the wrinkled pages of sheet music propped on the table. He'd lit the lamps and set out plates for supper, the stew pot simmering on the back of the stove. Tears welled in Mary Beth's eyes as she watched him play. The boy who'd arrived so guarded, so careful to take up little space, was filling their home with music. Thomas's music, learned from Thomas's books, played on Thomas's fiddle, as if her late husband's spirit had somehow passed into this child who needed a family as much as she needed a son. Mateo looked up, his fingers faltering on the strings when he saw them. "I did all my chores first," he said quickly, "and I've been practicing real careful, like you showed me with the books. Is it all right?" Mary Beth crossed to him, gathering him close, fiddle and all. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. So beautiful." She pressed a kiss to his dark hair. "You play just like your papa did." The boy stilled in her arms. It was the first time she'd referred to Thomas that way, acknowledging the place he would have had in Mateo's life if things had been different. If he'd lived to see this child become part of their family. "Really?" Mateo asked softly. "You think he would have liked hearing me play?" "I know he would have." She wiped her eyes, smiling. "He always said music was God's way of helping us speak what words couldn't say." Gideon moved quietly around them, serving up bowls of stew and slicing bread. But his eyes were warm as he watched them, seeing the bonds of love growing stronger between woman and child. Later that night, after Mateo was asleep upstairs, Mary Beth knelt beside her bed. The lamp cast soft shadows on the walls as she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "I've been wondering lately if I did right making the choices I made. Taking on a husband and child, going against what people thought proper." She twisted her hands together. "But tonight, hearing Thomas's music living on through Mateo, I have to ask, did you send them to me not as a burden, but as a blessing? Not to test my strength, but to save me from being alone?" She thought of Gideon's steady presence, his quiet protection, of Mateo's growing trust, his careful efforts to belong, of how empty the house had felt before they came, and how full of life it was now. "Please, Lord," she continued softly, "give me strength for whatever's coming. Help me protect this family you've given me, this land that's become our home." She touched Thomas's Bible on the bedside table. "And thank you. Thank you for showing me that love can grow in the most unexpected places if we just have faith enough to let it." The lamp flickered, its gentle light touching the familiar objects of her room. The quilt her mother made, Thomas's fiddle in its case, the family photographs on the wall. Outside, a nightbird called, and somewhere in the distance a coyote answered. The sounds of home, of the land she would fight to keep, no matter what battles lay ahead. The May sunshine warmed the churchyard as families gathered for the spring potluck, spreading checkered cloths over long tables beneath the cottonwood trees. Covered dishes lined the boards, fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread and pies of every description. The scent of good food mingled with the sweet perfume of lilac bushes blooming by the church steps. Mary Beth smoothed her blue cotton dress, no longer wearing widow's black. Beside her, Mateo had combed his hair neat and straight, wearing the new shirt she'd sewn him. Gideon, though still in his worn buckskins, had at least washed thoroughly and trimmed his beard. They made an unusual sight, the wealthy rancher's widow, the mountain man, and the Apache boy. But Mary Beth held her head high as they approached the gathering. Conversation quieted as they set their dishes on the table. Some folks nodded politely, while others turned away to whisper behind raised hands. Mary Beth felt the familiar ache of exclusion, but she focused on arranging her apple pies just so. "Those look mighty fine, Mrs. Calloway," said Mrs. Peterson, the clerk's wife, stepping forward with a warm smile. "And is this young man helping in the kitchen these days?" She gestured to Mateo. The boy ducked his head shyly. "Yes, ma'am. I helped peel the apples." "Well, now, ain't that something?" Mrs. Peterson's approval seemed to break the ice. Other women drifted closer, asking about the recipe, commenting on the lovely spring weather. Pastor Birch called everyone to prayer, and they formed a circle, holding hands. Mary Beth felt Mateo's small fingers wrap trustingly in hers on one side, Gideon's calloused palm steady on the other. The pastor's words washed over them. "Lord, bless this food and the hands that prepared it. Bless this community gathered here as neighbors and friends." After the blessing, folks began filling plates. Mary Beth noticed several children cautiously including Mateo in their games of tag around the trees. He moved carefully at first, then with growing confidence as they accepted him. "Your boy's got good manners," observed Tom Wilson, the blacksmith. "Does right by his elders." "He surely does," Mary Beth agreed, warmth spreading in her chest at the words, "your boy." But not everyone was won over. She caught snippets of harsh whispers. "Savage blood will tell. Proper widow wouldn't take up with his kind. Railroad'll sort them out soon enough." Gideon stood apart from the crowd, watching everything with quiet intensity. Now he approached Mary Beth, touching her elbow. "Got something to show you and the pastor," he said in a low voice. "Might be important." He led them to his horse, reaching into his saddlebag to withdraw a battered leather ledger. "Found this last week, going through my old trapping gear. Recognize the writing. It's Thomas's hand." Mary Beth's breath caught as she took the book. The pages were yellow with age, but she knew her husband's neat columns of figures and precise notations. "Where did you get this?" 3 years back, before Thomas passed," Gideon explained. "I was bringing in furs to trade, and he asked me to store some papers. Said he didn't trust his office anymore. Thought someone had been going through his things." Pastor Birch adjusted his spectacles, leaning in to examine the ledger. "These are business records?" "Look at the last few pages," Gideon said. They found entries dated just weeks before Thomas's death. There, in black and white, were notes about the railroad company's offers to buy the valley, and Thomas's repeated refusals to sell. "He wrote it all down," Mary Beth whispered. "Every meeting, every offer they made." "Folks ought to hear this," the pastor said firmly. He raised his voice. "Brothers and sisters, gather round. There's something you need to know about." The congregation drew close as Pastor Birch read aloud from the ledger. Thomas's words painted a clear picture. The railroad had tried to pressure him into selling, but he'd stood firm, believing the land should stay with the families who worked it. "Last entry here," the pastor continued, "says plain as day. Refused final offer. Won't sell my neighbors down the river, no matter how they threaten." He closed the book carefully. "Seems to me that settles the question of whether Thomas Calloway ever sold his land." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Mary Beth saw heads nodding, faces turning thoughtful. These people had known Thomas, respected him. His written testimony carried weight. "Always said Thomas Calloway was an honest man," declared old Mr. Jenkins, the hardware store owner. "If he wrote it, that's good enough for me." "Railroad can't just come in here making false claims," added another voice. "We'll stand with you, Mrs. Calloway," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "Won't we, folks?" The surge of support brought tears to Mary Beth's eyes. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly part of the community again. Mateo pressed against her side, and she wrapped an arm around his shoulders. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Billy Thompson's boy came running up, out of breath. "Fire," he gasped, "out at the Calloway place, and the barn's burning." Mary Beth's heart stopped. "The horses," she whispered, then louder, "the horses are in there." Gideon was already moving, swinging onto his mount. "Mateo, ride with me." The boy scrambled up behind him. Men were running for their horses, women calling out offers of help. "Go," Pastor Birch urged Mary Beth toward her wagon. "We'll follow with water barrels." The ride home was a blur of pounding hooves and rising terror. They crested the last hill to see orange flames lighting the darkening sky, black smoke billowing up. The big barn was engulfed, fire licking hungrily at its wooden walls. Gideon and Mateo reached it first. They'd already started pulling horses out when Mary Beth arrived. The animals were panicked, whites showing all around their eyes as they reared and bucked. "The well," Mary Beth shouted, running for buckets. "Form a line!" Neighbors appeared behind her, bringing whatever containers they could find. They formed a human chain, passing water from hand to hand while others tried to control the terrified livestock. Gideon and Mateo worked as one, the man's strength and the boy's speed complementing each other as they drove frightened horses to safety. Mary Beth's heart was in her throat every time they disappeared into the smoke-filled barn. And they kept going back again and again. She found herself praying aloud as she worked. "Lord, protect them, save them, please." The heat was intense, sweat streaming down faces black with soot. The crackle of flames mixed with shouts of men and the screaming of horses. Just as they got the last animal out, there was an ominous cracking sound. "Get back," Gideon roared. They barely made it clear before the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. They could only watch as the barn fell in on itself, decades of solid construction reduced to glowing embers. The water brigade turned to protecting nearby buildings, making sure the fire wouldn't spread. When it was finally over, they stood in the smoky darkness counting their blessings. Most of the herd was safe, though 2 young colts hadn't made it out. The ranch house was untouched, and no people were seriously hurt, though several had minor burns and everyone was coughing from the smoke. "This wasn't no accident," Gideon said grimly, holding up a broken lantern he'd found by the barn door. It reeked of coal oil. Somebody meant for this to happen. Mary Beth stared at the ruins of the barn, her grandfather's barn where she'd played as a girl, and Thomas had taught her to milk cows. Anger rose in her throat, hot as the flames that had destroyed it. "The railroad, she's saying they're trying to drive us out." "They won't succeed," Matteo said quietly. His small face was streaked with soot, but his eyes were fierce. "We're family now. We protect each other." Neighbors gathered around them, offering help with rebuilding, places to keep their stock until new shelter could be raised. The pastor's wife pressed a basket of food into Mary Beth's hands. "You're not alone in this fight," she said firmly. But as Mary Beth looked at the destruction, she knew this was just the beginning. Their enemies had declared war, not with legal papers this time, but with fire and fear. They would have to be stronger than ever to face what was coming. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the night air as she led her unusual family into the house. Tomorrow they would begin cleaning up, making plans to rebuild. Tonight, they would hold each other close and thank God for what they hadn't lost. Dawn painted the Colorado foothills in soft rose and gold, but Mary Beth could barely lift her eyes to appreciate it. Her muscles ached from 3 days of hauling charred timber, and her hands, unused to such rough work, were covered in blisters. Still, she gripped another blackened beam and helped Gideon drag it clear of the barn ruins. "You should rest," Gideon said, his voice gruff with concern. "This ain't ladies' work." Mary Beth straightened her back, ignoring the protest of tired muscles. "It's my work now," she replied firmly. "This is my ranch too." Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Respect, maybe even pride. He nodded once and returned to the task. They worked side by side as the morning wore on, sorting what could be salvaged from what was lost. Matteo darted between them, gathering smaller pieces into a wheelbarrow. The boy moved with quiet efficiency, his dark eyes watching everything. He'd hardly spoken since the fire, but his presence was steady, dependable. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Peterson's wagon rattled up the drive. She climbed down carefully, balancing a covered dish. "Brought you some chicken and dumplings," she announced. "Can't have you working on empty stomachs." "Much obliged," Mary Beth said, wiping soot from her hands onto her already filthy apron. It was the 3rd such offering in as many days. Casseroles and pies delivered with worried looks and whispered sympathy. But none of the visitors stayed to help with the real work. Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted around the ruins. "Such a shame," she clucked. "If you need anything." She left the offer hanging, already backing toward her wagon. "We could use some strongbacks," Gideon said quietly. But Mrs. Peterson was already climbing up to her seat, pretending not to hear. They watched her drive away, dust rising behind the wagon wheels. Mary Beth sighed. "At least they bring food." "Reckon that's safer than taking sides," Gideon replied, a bitter edge to his voice. He grabbed another beam, muscles straining under his worn shirt. They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only when Matteo insisted they eat some of Mrs. Peterson's dumplings. The food was good, but it stuck in Mary Beth's throat as she looked at the mountain of work still ahead. As afternoon faded to evening, Gideon finally called a halt. "Lights going. We'll do more harm than good working blind." Mary Beth nodded, too exhausted to argue. Her hands trembled as she washed them at the pump, the cool water stinging her blisters. Inside, she lit the lamps while Matteo set the table for a simple supper of bread and cold meat. Later, when Mateo had gone to bed, Mary Beth brewed coffee. She carried 2 cups out to the porch where Gideon sat, staring into the darkness. The night was cool, crickets chirping in the grass. "Thank you," he said, taking the offered cup. His rough fingers brushed hers, sending an unexpected warmth through her tired body. They sat in companionable silence for a while, steam rising from their cups. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the shadowed ruins of the barn. "Never thought I'd have this again," Gideon said suddenly, his voice low. "A home. People to care for." Mary Beth turned to look at him, sensing something important in his tone. His face was half hidden in shadow, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "There's something you should know," he continued, "about why I live alone in the hills." He took a deep breath. "Years back, I killed a man." Mary Beth's hands tightened on her cup, but she didn't speak. "It was in a saloon in Denver. I was drunk, spent most of my time drunk back then. He said something, I said something back. Fists flew. I knocked him down and..." Gideon's voice roughened. His head hit wrong on a table edge. He never got up. The cricket song seemed very loud in the silence that followed. "The law called it self-defense, but that don't make it right. I ran to the hills after that, figured I didn't deserve to live among decent folks." He wouldn't look at her. "You should know what kind of man you married." Mary Beth set her cup down carefully. "I know exactly what kind of man I married," she said. "I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you work without complaint, how gentle you are with Mateo, how you risk yourself to save others' livestock." She touched his arm lightly. "God's mercy is bigger than our past sins, Gideon. I believe he brought you here for a purpose." Gideon's breath caught. He turned to her then, his eyes bright in the lamplight. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. Wanted him to, perhaps. But he only covered her hand with his own, rough palm warm against her skin. The moment was broken by the soft creak of the door. Mateo stood there in his nightshirt, looking troubled. "What's wrong, child?" Mary Beth asked. "I need to tell you something," he said, coming to sit between them. "About the fire." Gideon's hand tightened on Mary Beth's. "What about it?" "Yesterday in town, when I was waiting outside the store," Mateo spoke carefully, "I heard men talking behind the livery. They didn't see me. They were laughing about the fire, saying the railroad man paid good money for the job." "Who were they?" Gideon demanded, half rising. "The Carson brothers," Mateo said. "They said Mr. Lowell promised them more work if they could scare us off the land." Gideon swore under his breath, starting for his gun belt hanging by the door, but Mary Beth caught his arm. "No," she said firmly, "violence won't solve this. They burned your barn." Gideon's voice was harsh with anger. "They could have killed our horses, our boy. And what will more bloodshed accomplish?" And Mary Beth stood facing him. "Get yourself shot or hanged. Leave Mateo fatherless again?" Her voice softened. "We need to be smarter than them, Gideon. Trust that God will show us a better way." The struggle was plain on his face, rage warring with reason. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "You're right," he admitted. "But I won't stand by if they come at us again." "We'll face whatever comes together," Mary Beth said. She drew both Gideon and Mateo into a fierce embrace. As a family. They stood there on the porch holding each other while the moon climbed higher. The ruins of the barn were a dark reminder of their enemy's reach, but Mary Beth felt strength in their unity. Whatever the railroad and its hired men planned next, they would meet it with courage, wit, and faith. Later, after Mateo had gone back to bed, Mary Beth and Gideon sat close together on the porch steps. No words passed between them, but something had shifted. His confession had built a bridge of trust, and her acceptance had strengthened it. Though they hadn't shared a kiss, their hearts were drawing closer with each passing day. The night deepened around them, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that reminded them of all they had to lose. But they were no longer alone in their struggles. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. The July sun beat down mercilessly as Gideon and Mary Beth worked side by side, raising new beams for the barn. Sweat trickled down their faces, but neither complained. Mateo darted between them, carrying tools and water, eager to help however he could. Hold it steady now, Gideon called as they positioned another heavy timber. The work was slow, but each day brought progress. What had begun as charred ruins was slowly taking shape again, stronger than before. Like this, as Mateo asked, bracing a support beam with all his might. Just right, Gideon nodded, pride warming his voice. You're getting strong, boy. Mary Beth paused to wipe her brow, watching them work together. These past weeks had changed them all. Her soft hands had grown calloused, but her heart had grown fuller. Gideon's gruff manner had gentled, especially with Mateo. And the boy himself stood taller, more confident in his place with them. As evening approached, Mary Beth reluctantly called a halt. We need to clean up, she reminded them. The town dances tonight. Gideon's face fell slightly. Maybe you and Mateo should go without me. I ain't much for dancing. Nonsense, Mary Beth said firmly. We're going as a family. She saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt about facing the town's judgment. Besides, she added softly, I'd like to dance with my husband. His expression softened at that, though anxiety still clouded his features. They headed inside to wash and change, Mateo practically bouncing with excitement. It would be his first town dance. An hour later, they drove the wagon into town, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Mary Beth had put on her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. Gideon wore his one good shirt, carefully pressed, though his boots still showed traces of work despite his best efforts to clean them. Mateo sat between them, freshly scrubbed and fidgeting with his collar. The town hall glowed with lamplight, fiddle music spilling out into the twilight. Couples and families streamed in, the women's skirts swishing, children darting between adults' legs. Mary Beth felt the weight of stares as they entered, but she held her head high. Inside, the hall was festive with paper streamers and oil lamps. The music was lively, couples already spinning across the wooden floor. Some neighbors nodded greeting, while others turned away pointedly. Mary Beth noticed Mrs. Peterson whispering behind her fan to a group of ladies, their eyes sharp with judgment. Go on outside with the other children, Mary Beth told Mateo gently, seeing his longing looks toward the door where young voices could be heard playing. Just stay where we can find you. Mateo hesitated, then slipped away into the gathering dusk. Mary Beth watched him go, praying he would find acceptance among the children, if not their parents. The music changed to a waltz, sweet and slow. Gideon shifted uncomfortably beside her, but then squared his shoulders. May I have this dance? He asked formally, holding out his hand. Mary Beth's heart quickened as she took it. His palm was rough against hers, but his touch was gentle as he led her onto the floor. They moved awkwardly at first, finding their rhythm. Gideon's steps were uncertain, but his arm was steady around her waist. I ain't danced since I was a young man, he admitted quietly. You're doing fine, she assured him, following his lead. As they turned, she caught glimpses of other dancers' faces, some smiling in approval, others frowning at their closeness. But for once, she didn't care what they thought. In Gideon's arms, moving to the music, she felt truly happy for the first time since her first husband's death. The moment was shattered by a commotion outside. Children's voices rose in anger, followed by the sound of scuffling. Mary Beth's heart clenched. She knew instinctively that Mateo was involved. They hurried outside to find a circle of children watching as Tommy Carson, one of the burning barn culprit's sons, pushed Mateo roughly. Railroad trash, the boy taunted. Your pa's probably some track layer who ran off. Mateo stood silent, fists clenched but not fighting back. His dark eyes were full of hurt, but he held himself with dignity. Mary Beth felt fierce pride even as anger rose in her throat. That's enough, she said sharply, pushing through the circle. She took Mateo's hand firmly in hers, feeling it trembling slightly. Come inside, son. Tommy sneered. He ain't your son. Everyone knows you just took him in because he is family? Mary Beth cut him off, her voice ringing with conviction. And family stands together. She saw Gideon step forward, his expression thunderous, but she shook her head slightly. Violence would only make things worse. Inside, the music had stopped, people watching curiously. Mary Beth led Mateo to a quiet corner, kneeling to check him for injuries. Are you hurt? No, ma'am, he whispered. I wanted to hit him back, but I remembered what you said about being better than them. You did right, she said softly, smoothing his rumpled shirt. I'm proud of you. The music started up again, a lively reel this time. Gideon appeared beside them, his face still dark with anger. Maybe we should head home. But Mary Beth stood firm. No, we won't let them drive us away. She turned to Mateo. Would you like to learn to dance? The boy's face lit up with surprise. Soon they were all three on the floor, Mary Beth showing them the simple steps of a country dance. Mateo caught on quickly, his natural grace showing through. Even Gideon began to relax, a rare smile touching his lips as they moved together. By the time they left, the moon was high and bright. They walked home instead of taking the wagon, enjoying the cool night air. Mateo ran ahead, chasing fireflies, his earlier hurt forgotten in the simple joy of summer evening play. Gideon and Mary Beth walked more slowly, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The stars spread above them like diamond dust, crickets singing in the grass. Finally, Gideon broke the comfortable silence. I need to thank you, he said quietly. For what? For choosing me. For choosing Mateo, his voice roughened with emotion. For making us a family when nobody else would. Mary Beth stopped walking, turning to face him in the starlight. I don't regret it, she said with quiet conviction. Not for a single moment. The truth of it rang in her heart. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, born of desperate need, had grown into something deeper. She saw it in Gideon's eyes, too, the tender way he looked at her, so different from his early wariness. They stood there a moment longer, the night soft around them. Ahead, Mateo's laughter floated back as he chased another firefly. The sound seemed to embody all their hopes, for acceptance, for belonging, for love freely given and received. Come on, Mary Beth said at last, taking Gideon's hand. Let's catch up with our boy. They walked on together, their fingers entwined toward home and the future they were building. The dance had brought both joy and pain, but they had faced it together. Their bond was stronger for it, growing despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges they faced. The farmhouse appeared ahead, its windows glowing with welcome. Mateo waited for them on the porch, his smile bright in the darkness. Looking at him and Gideon, Mary Beth felt her heart swell with love for this unlikely family God had given her. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew with certainty that she had made the right choice. The autumn morning dawned cold and sharp, frost glinting on the fence rails. Mary Beth stood at the kitchen window, watching golden leaves spiral down from the cottonwoods. The coffee pot bubbled on the wood stove, filling the room with its rich aroma. Outside, Gideon and Mateo worked together, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air as they repaired a broken wagon wheel. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. A group of riders appeared on the road, kicking up dust. Mary Beth's heart sank as she recognized the railroad agent's sleek bay stallion in the lead. But this time, he wasn't alone. Gideon, she called through the open door, had company coming. He straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. When he saw the riders, his face hardened. Mateo pressed close to his side, dark eyes wary. The railroad agent missed her. Lowell dismounted first, his polished boots gleaming. Behind him, a lean man with cold eyes swung down from a tall black horse. His gun belt rode low on his hip, the well-worn holster speaking of frequent use. Mrs. Calloway, Lowell called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. I believe you know Clay Danner? Gideon's posture stiffened at the name. Mary Beth glanced between the two men, seeing recognition flash in their eyes, and, with it, old hatred. Clay Danner stepped forward, spurs jingling. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Been a while, Hale. Last time I saw you, you got lucky in that draw. His hand rested casually on his gun belt. Real lucky. State your business, Mary Beth said firmly, moving to stand beside Gideon. We've already told you we have proof this land wasn't sold. Ah yes, about that proof. Lowell withdrew a sheaf of papers from his coat. We've made a rather disturbing discovery. These documents show that your husband has been falsifying records. That's a lie, Gideon said quietly. Several more riders appeared on the road. Word must have spread in town, drawing curious onlookers. Mary Beth recognized faces from church, some concerned, others openly hostile. Clay moved closer, his boot heels striking the packed earth like hammer blows. "We got witnesses saying you forged those ledgers, Hale. Trying to steal a widow's land, that's mighty low, even for trash like you." Mateo edged forward. "He didn't steal anything, he's helping us save the ranch." Clay's hand shot out, catching the boy across the face with enough force to knock him down. "Keep your mouth shut, half-breed." Gideon lunged forward with a roar of rage, his hand dropping to his hip. Mary Beth grabbed his arm. "No," she cried. "Don't give them what they want." For a terrible moment, she felt his muscles bunch to strike. Then slowly, trembling with suppressed fury, he lowered his hand. Clay laughed, the sound ugly. "Still hiding behind women's skirts, I see. But you can't hide from justice." He turned to address the growing crowd. "This man's been lying to you all, using an innocent widow to try and cheat the railroad. And I aim to see him pay." "We have the law on our side," Mary Beth declared, though her voice shook. "If you have accusations, take them to the proper authorities." "Oh, we have," Lowell said smoothly. As if on cue, the clip-clop of horses announced new arrivals. 2 county deputies rode up, their badges catching the autumn sunlight. "Gideon Hale," the senior deputy called out, "you're under arrest for fraud and forgery." Mateo scrambled to his feet, tears streaming down his face where Clay had struck him. "No, you can't take him." "It's all right, son," Gideon said softly. He looked at Mary Beth, his eyes full of unspoken words. "We knew they'd try something like this. Truth will come out." The deputies dismounted, one holding manacles that clinked ominously. Clay's smile widened as they approached Gideon. "You can't do this," Mary Beth protested. "These charges are false. They're trying to steal our land." But the deputies were already leading Gideon to their wagon. The gathered crowd parted, some looking away, others watching with undisguised satisfaction. Mateo clung to Mary Beth's skirt, his small body shaking with sobs. Clay stepped close to her, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Better start packing, Mrs. Holloway, once your husband is convicted, that land will belong to the railroad. And we don't tolerate squatters, especially not their kind." His eyes flicked meaningfully to Mateo. Mary Beth drew herself up, meeting his gaze steadily. "The Lord sees your lies, Mr. Danner, and he sees your hate. I pray he shows you more mercy than you've shown us." He tipped his hat mockingly and turned away. Lowell was already mounting up, satisfied with their morning's work. The deputies helped Gideon into the wagon, the manacles glinting dully in the autumn light. "Mary Beth," Gideon called out, "the truth's in God's hands now. You keep our boys safe." She watched through tears as the wagon rolled away, Mateo pressing against her side. The gathered townsfolk began to disperse, their whispered conversations carried on the wind. Clay Danner's laughter echoed down the road, sharp as a knife. When the dust had settled, Mary Beth knelt and gathered Mateo close. His cheek was red where Clay had struck him, but his eyes were fierce with determination beyond his years. "We're going to get him back," she promised, smoothing his dark hair. "God didn't bring us together just to let evil men tear us apart." Inside, the coffee pot had boiled over, filling the kitchen with bitter smoke. Mary Beth barely noticed. Her mind was already racing, planning how to prove Gideon's innocence. The railroad thought they could break their family with false charges and brute force, but they didn't understand the strength of love or the power of truth. As the autumn wind whispered through the cottonwoods, Mary Beth held Mateo close and prayed for guidance. Somewhere in town, her husband sat in a cell, facing false charges that could destroy everything they'd built. But she wouldn't let that happen. Whatever it took, she would find a way to bring him home. The lantern light from town glowed faintly in the distance as darkness fell. Mateo had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, tear tracks still visible on his cheeks. Mary Beth sat at her husband's desk, poring over every paper they had, searching for anything that might help prove his innocence. She touched the ledger that had seemed like salvation just weeks ago. Now Clay Danner claimed it was forged, using it as a weapon against them. But she knew in her heart that Gideon was innocent. The truth was there somewhere, she just had to find it. "Lord," she whispered into the quiet night, "give me strength. Show me the way to justice." The wind picked up, rattling the windows like a response to her prayer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would not rest until she had a plan. Gideon had protected their family since the day she proposed. Now, it was her turn to fight for him. Dawn broke cold and gray over the small town jail. Mary Beth pulled her shawl tighter as she followed the deputy down the narrow corridor, her boots echoing against the wooden floor. The smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the air. 5 minutes, Mrs. Calloway, the deputy said, unlocking the heavy iron door. That's all the sheriff allows. She found Gideon sitting on a thin mattress, his broad shoulders slumped. The cell was barely wide enough for him to stretch out, with only a small window letting in weak morning light. When he looked up, the defeat in his eyes made her heart ache. You shouldn't have come, he said quietly. Folks will talk. Let them talk. Mary Beth gripped the iron bars, willing strength into her voice. I'm your wife now, Gideon. That means something to me. He rose slowly, moving to stand before her. His buckskins had been replaced with rough prison clothes, and dark stubble shadowed his jaw. Clay Danner's got money behind him, railroad money, and half the town ready to swear I forged those papers. The truth will come out, Mary Beth insisted. God sees everything. Gideon's laugh was bitter. God ain't the one sitting on that judge's bench, and Clay's been waiting years to see me hang. He turned away, pacing the narrow space. I should never have agreed to marry you. Brought nothing but trouble to your door. Stop that right now. Mary Beth's voice cracked like a whip. You listen to me, Gideon Hale. You and Mateo are the best things that ever happened to me since Thomas died. The Lord brought us together for a reason, and I won't let you give up. He stopped pacing, something flickering in his eyes. Mateo, how is he? Scared, missing you something fierce, she softened her tone. But he's strong, like his father. I ain't his real father. You're the only father he's got now, and he needs you to fight. Mary Beth reached through the bars, touching his rough cheek. We both do. Gideon closed his eyes, leaning into her touch for a moment. Then he straightened, squaring his shoulders. What do you need me to do? Pray with me. She held out her other hand. Right now. He hesitated, then took her offered hands through the bars. Together, they bowed their heads as Mary Beth's clear voice filled the cold cell. Lord, we come before you in our hour of need. Let truth shine through darkness. Give us strength to face what comes. Protect our family and guide us to justice. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen, Gideon whispered. The deputy's boots announced his return. Time's up. Mary Beth squeezed Gideon's hands once more before letting go. I'll be back tomorrow. Keep faith. She held her head high as she left the jail, though her heart was heavy. Outside, the morning bustle of town was beginning. Several people crossed the street to avoid her, whispering behind their hands. She ignored them, heading straight for the courthouse. The county judge's office was warm, lined with leather-bound law books. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers as she entered. Mrs. Calloway, I assumed you'd be calling. Your Honor, I need to discuss my husband's case. The evidence against Mr. Hale appears quite solid. He shuffled some papers. Multiple witnesses claim they saw him creating false documents. Those witnesses are lying, Mary Beth said firmly. The railroad is trying to steal our land. That's a serious accusation. The judge finally met her eyes. Do you have proof? Give me time to gather it, please, Your Honor. The trial is set for next week. Mr. Danner was most insistent about proceeding quickly. He returned to his papers. Good day, Mrs. Calloway. Mary Beth recognized the dismissal but stood her ground. Judge Harrison, you've known me 15 years, known my late husband longer. Do you truly believe I would marry a criminal? He sighed, removing his spectacles. What I believe doesn't matter, only evidence matters in court. And right now, all the evidence points to fraud. She left the courthouse with her head spinning. The morning was half gone as she rode back to the ranch, the familiar hills offering no comfort. The barn they'd rebuilt together stood as a testament to their family's strength. But would it be enough? The house was quiet when she entered, too quiet. Mateo? She called out. No answer. She checked the kitchen, his bedroom, the back porch. Finally, she climbed the ladder to the hayloft where he often went to think. She found his favorite book lying open, pages ruffling in the draft from the hay door. Mateo, honey, are you up here? A piece of paper fluttered near the book. Mary Beth's hands trembled as she picked it up, recognizing Mateo's careful schoolboy writing. Dear Mama Mary Beth, I heard them say Papa Gideon will go to prison. I can't let that happen. I know something that will help, but I have to ride to find it. Please don't worry. I promise to protect our family too. Love, Mateo. No, she whispered. Oh no. She flew down the ladder and ran to the corral. His pony was gone, along with his bedroll and canteen. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized he must have slipped away during the night while she was absorbed in searching papers. Dawn was breaking as she saddled her horse with shaking hands. Mateo had several hours' head start, riding alone through dangerous country. Anything could happen to an 11-year-old boy on his own. She strapped on her husband's old gun belt, checking the revolver was loaded. Then she swung into the saddle, scanning the ground for tracks. Thank God Gideon had taught her to read sign. The pony's hoofprints led north toward the high country where Gideon used to trap. What did Mateo think he would find up there? And how far would he go alone? Lord, protect him, she prayed, touching her heels to her horse's flanks. Help me find him before it's too late. The morning sun climbed higher as she followed the trail, her heart pounding in time with her horse's hooves. Somewhere ahead, her son was riding into danger, believing he could save their family. She had promised to never let him be taken away. Now, she prayed she could keep that promise. The tracks led steadily northward, growing fresher as she pushed her horse to make up lost time. Mateo was clever, but he was still just a boy. She had to reach him before darkness fell, before wild animals or worse found him first. She topped a rise and pulled up short. In the valley below, a small figure on a pony was picking his way through scattered boulders. Her relief was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Mateo, she called out, her voice carrying on the wind. Wait for me. The figure turned, then waited as she rode down to join him. As she drew closer, she could see the fear and determination warring on his young face. I have to help Papa Gideon, he said before she could speak. I know where to find something important. You scared me half to death running off like that. She reached out to touch his cheek, still bearing the mark of Clay's strike. What's so important you had to come alone? I remembered something Papa Gideon said about his old cabin. Mateo's dark eyes were intense. About papers he kept there. Maybe they'll prove he's telling the truth. Mary Beth studied him for a long moment. He sat his pony like a natural horseman, his chin lifted with the same quiet dignity she'd seen in Gideon. He wasn't just a frightened boy running away. He was trying to save his father. All right, she said finally, but we go together. Show me the way. Relief flooded his face. They rode side by side through the morning, following game trails higher into the hills. Mateo led confidently, explaining how Gideon had described landmarks to him during their long talks about trapping. The sun was high overhead when they reached a small clearing. An old cabin sagged against the mountainside, its roof partially collapsed. Mateo dismounted quickly. This is it. He said he kept important things under a loose board by the fireplace. They entered carefully, testing each step on the rotting floorboards. The cabin smelled of dust and abandonment. Mary Beth helped Mateo pry up boards near the stone fireplace until they found a small oilskin packet. What's in it? Mateo asked anxiously as she unwrapped it. Mary Beth's hands shook as she examined the contents. Old letters, a deed, carefully preserved newspaper clippings, and at the bottom, a sworn statement dated 15 years ago, describing a fight where Gideon had killed a man in self-defense after being attacked. The paper was signed by Clay Danner himself, admitting he had seen the whole thing. Oh, Lord, she breathed. This is why Clay hates him so much. He had to admit the truth back then, but he's never forgiven Gideon for surviving. Will it help Papa Gideon? Yes, honey. She hugged him close. It shows Clay is willing to lie under oath. If he lied then about wanting Gideon dead, he could be lying now about the ledgers. Mateo's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. Then let's hurry back. We can save him. They rode home as quickly as safety allowed, the precious packet secured in Mary Beth's saddlebags. She said a silent prayer of thanks for her brave, clever son who had known where to look when all seemed lost. The sun was setting as they approached the ranch, painting the sky in sheets of gold and crimson. Mary Beth's muscles ached from the long ride, but hope burned bright in her chest. Tomorrow she would take this evidence to the judge. Tomorrow they would begin fighting back. But for tonight she had her son safe beside her and proof that could save her husband. It would have to be enough. Mateo guided his pony through the darkening streets, keeping to the shadows. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tied the reins behind the parsonage. The church bells tolled 8 times, their deep rings making him jump. He had watched the pastor leave earlier, carrying his Bible toward the saloon where he sometimes preached to minors. Now the building stood silent and dark. The boy crept around back where wooden crates were stacked against the wall. He had helped stack them himself last month while doing chores for the pastor's wife. Climbing carefully, he reached the small window that ventured into the attic. It creaked open under his touch. Mateo slipped inside, landing softly on dusty floorboards. The musty air made his nose twitch. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, casting strange shadows among the stored items. He pulled a stub of candle from his pocket, borrowed from Mama Mary Beth's kitchen drawer, and struck a match. The flame flickered across stacked boxes and trunks, old hymnals, broken furniture, cobwebs everywhere. But Mateo remembered what he had overheard 2 weeks ago, when he was supposed to be sweeping the church steps. The pastor and his wife talking about old records stored away upstairs. Papers from when the church was first built, including land deeds and treaties that had never been properly filed. He began searching methodically, the way Papa Gideon had taught him to track game. Start at one corner. Work your way across. Leave no stone unturned. His small hands opened boxes and rifled through papers, careful not to tear anything. An hour passed, then another. His candle burned lower. Dust coated his clothes and made him want to sneeze. But he kept looking, driven by the memory of Papa Gideon's face behind the jail's iron bars. Finally, in a water-stained trunk pushed far under the eaves, his fingers touched oilskin. He pulled out a thick packet wrapped in faded ribbon. His hands trembled as he untied it. The papers inside were yellow with age, the ink faded but still readable. Treaties with local tribes, marking boundaries. Original town papers. And there, a deed filing for the valley, dated before the railroad even existed. Proof that the land had been properly claimed long ago. Mateo's heart leaped. This was it. This would save Papa Gideon, save their ranch. He carefully rewrapped the packet and tucked it inside his shirt. A floorboard creaked below. He froze, barely breathing. Heavy boots climbed the stairs to the church proper. A door opened and closed. "Check up there," a man's voice ordered. Clay Danner's voice. "That Indian brat's horse is out back. He has to be here somewhere." Mateo blew out his candle. Darkness crashed down around him as Boots approached the attic stairs. A lantern beam swept the floor below. He crouched behind a stack of boxes, making himself small like a rabbit hiding from coyotes. The attic door groaned open. Light spilled across the dusty floor. "Come out, boy," Clay called, his voice sickly sweet. "I know you're up here. Make it easy on yourself. The marshal's waiting to hear why you're breaking into the church at night." Mateo's heart pounded so hard he feared Clay would hear it. The lantern beam moved closer, closer. He could smell tobacco smoke and whiskey. There is a second window on the far side. If he could reach it without being seen. He waited until Clay turned away, then darted from his hiding place. Boards creaked under his feet. "There you are." Clay lunged forward. Mateo ran, ducking under a beam. His shoulder hit a box, sending it crashing. He reached the window and yanked it open as Boots thundered behind him. "Stop or I'll shoot." Mateo dove through the opening. He hit the sloped church roof hard, sliding down shingles. The ground rushed up. He tucked and rolled as he landed, just like Papa Gideon taught him. Pain shot through his ankle, but he forced himself up. He could hear Clay cursing, climbing down after him. Mateo limped into the shadows between buildings. Hoofbeats approached. The boy pressed himself against a wall, holding his breath. But the rider wasn't Clay. It was Mama Mary Beth on her bay mare, reins in one hand and rifle in the other. "Mateo," she whispered urgently, "quick!" He grabbed her outstretched hand. She pulled him up behind her just as Clay emerged from the alley. "Stop right there!" Clay's revolver gleamed in the moonlight. Mary Beth's heels touched the horse's flanks. They thundered down the street as a shot cracked behind them. Mateo clutched her waist, the precious packet still safe against his chest. More hoofbeats echoed as Clay gave chase, but Mary Beth knew these streets, knew the quickest way home. She guided them down back alleys and through the creek bed while Mateo held on tight. The moon sailed high overhead as they galloped across open country. The ranch house finally appeared, dark and welcoming. Only when they were safely inside did Mateo pull out the packet with shaking hands. "I found it, Mama," he said, voice trembling with excitement and leftover fear. "The real papers. They prove the railroad is lying." Mary Beth lit a lamp and carefully unfolded the documents. Her eyes grew wide as she read. "Oh, Mateo." She pulled him close, kissing his dusty head. "You wonderful, brave boy. This is exactly what we needed. These will save your Papa Gideon." He leaned into her embrace, suddenly exhausted but happy. The packet was safe. Their family would be safe. That was worth any risk. Outside, an owl called across the moonlit valley. The sound seemed to carry a promise. Tomorrow would bring justice, and Papa Gideon would come home where he belonged. Dawn painted the courthouse steps in pale gold as Mary Beth and Mateo climbed them, the precious packet clutched tightly in her hands. Inside, the county judge peered at them over his wire-rimmed spectacles, gesturing them forward. Before Mary Beth could speak, the door burst open. Clay Danner stormed in, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished floor. "Those papers are worthless," he snarled. "Probably forged by that Indian boy." "That is quite enough, Mr. Danner," a firm voice declared. Pastor Birch stepped forward from the shadows, his Bible tucked under one arm. "I can verify these documents myself. They were misplaced in the church records decades ago, filed away and forgotten until now." The judge called for an immediate hearing. As afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, deputies brought Gideon in, still in shackles. His eyes found Mary Beth and Mateo in the front row, their fingers intertwined. The courtroom filled quickly with townsfolk, their whispers like rustling leaves. Silence fell as the judge began reading aloud. The original deed. The treaty boundaries. With each revelation, Clay's face grew darker. When the judge held up Clay's forged papers beside the originals, the difference was clear as day. "This evidence proves deliberate fraud," the judge declared. "Mr. Hale is to be released immediately." Clay's hand darted toward his gun, but Gideon, despite his chains, moved like lightning. He knocked Clay's arm aside just as the weapon cleared leather. The pistol clattered across floorboards as deputies seized the struggling gunman. Through the commotion, the railroad agent slipped away, his scheme in ruins. No one paid him any mind. All eyes were on Gideon as a deputy unlocked his shackles. Mary Beth rushed forward, throwing her arms around him. Before the whole town, she held him close, her tears falling freely now. Mateo pressed against them both, their family whole again at last. Sunlight warmed their backs as Mary Beth, Gideon, and Mateo rode home from the courthouse. The sight that greeted them made Mary Beth catch her breath. A dozen neighbors stood in their yard, tools in hand, ready to help rebuild the barn properly. "Reckon we owe you this much," old Tom Wheeler called out, touching his hat brim. "After what Clay put you through." Gideon's weathered face softened with surprise. Men who'd once shunned him now offered handshakes. Women who'd whispered behind fans brought baskets of food. The sound of hammers and saws filled the afternoon air. Mary Beth set about feeding everyone, her kitchen alive with the aroma of beef stew and fresh cornbread. She watched through the window as Gideon and Mateo worked alongside the volunteers, their movements in easy harmony. As dusk approached, Pastor Birch arrived in his buggy, carrying important papers. "The Lord's timing is perfect," he said, settling at their kitchen table. "These adoption documents will make Mateo legally your son." Mary Beth's hands trembled as she signed. Gideon's signature came next, careful and deliberate. The pastor witnessed it with a flourish, making it official. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home, Gideon knelt beside Mateo's bed. His voice was rough with emotion. "I ain't always been a man to be proud of, son, but I promise to raise you with honor from here on." Mateo's dark eyes shone. "I know you will, Father." From the doorway, Mary Beth watched, tears sliding down her cheeks. The ranch deed lay on the table downstairs, now bearing both their names. God's providence had led them here. 3 lost souls bound together by love and trust. Her prayer of thanks rose silently in the quiet house, grateful for this new family, newly blessed and finally whole. Winter settled over the Colorado foothills like a soft white blanket, transforming the valley into a pristine wonderland. Snow drifted against the new barn's sturdy walls, its fresh-cut timber standing proud against the steel-gray sky. Inside, lantern light spilled from windows onto the crusted snow, marking the Hale family homestead as a beacon of warmth in the gathering dusk. Mary Beth cleared the supper dishes, listening to the comfortable sounds of Mateo helping Gideon tend to evening chores. Their boots scraped on the porch, shaking off snow before they entered the kitchen. The boy's cheeks were rosy from the cold, his dark eyes bright as he hung up his coat. "Time for bed, son," Gideon said softly, ruffling Mateo's hair. The boy nodded, pausing to hug Mary Beth before heading upstairs. Once his footsteps faded, Mary Beth retrieved her late husband's Bible from its shelf. The leather was worn smooth from years of faithful reading. She placed it on the kitchen table and lit the lamp, its gentle glow creating a circle of golden light. "Would you read tonight?" she asked Gideon, her voice gentle. "I'd like to hear you lead us in prayer." Gideon settled into the chair beside her, his rough hands tentative as he opened the Bible. His finger traced the lines slowly, his voice low and unsteady as he read from the Book of Ruth. The words of loyalty and redemption filled the quiet kitchen. When he finished reading, Gideon bowed his head. "Lord," he began, his voice catching, "I ain't much for fancy words, but I thank you for this family you've given me, for Mary Beth's brave heart, and for letting me be a father to Mateo. Help me be worthy of them both, amen." They moved to the hearth afterward, where pine logs crackled and sparked. Mary Beth watched the flames dance, gathering her courage. "I need to tell you something, Gideon," she said softly. "That day in church when I asked you to marry me, I was desperate, afraid of losing everything." Gideon's eyes met hers, steady and warm in the firelight. "I know that, Mary Beth. But now I see God's hand in it all," she continued. "He knew what we all needed, even when we didn't." "You're the bravest woman I've ever known," Gideon said, taking her hand in his calloused one. "Choosing me, choosing Mateo, standing firm against those who'd take this land. The Lord sure blessed me the day you spoke up in that church." Mary Beth's heart quickened as Gideon leaned closer. His kiss was gentle, almost reverent, warming her like the hearth fire's glow. Above them, Mateo's soft footsteps crossed his bedroom floor, the sound of their son safe in his bed completing the precious moment. When they drew apart, tears shone in Mary Beth's eyes. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls of their home, no longer just a house of necessity, but a sanctuary of love built on faith, courage, and the providence of God. Spring returned to the Colorado foothills, painting the valley in tender greens and wildflower colors. The morning sun sparkled on fresh dew as cattle grazed contentedly across pastures that had once been threatened by railroad tracks. Birds called from newly leafed cottonwoods, their songs mixing with the distant ring of Mateo's spurs as he rode the fence line. The boy sat tall in his saddle now, no longer the frightened orphan who had arrived months ago. His dark eyes were bright with confidence as he guided his pony through familiar gates. Neighbors waved as he passed, the same folk who had once turned away now greeting him warmly. The change had come gradually, like spring itself, as the community learned to see past their prejudices to the family's true worth. On a crisp Sunday morning, the Hales rode their wagon into town for services. Mary Beth wore a blue cotton dress instead of widow's black, her face serene as Gideon helped her down from the seat. Inside the clapboard church, sunlight streamed through windows onto familiar faces that now smiled in welcome. The same pews that had once witnessed scandal now held a respected family, their presence unremarkable except for the joy they brought. After the final hymn, children gathered on the church steps, drawn by the sweet notes of Mateo's fiddle. His fingers, once uncertain, now danced confidently across the strings as he played the tunes Mary Beth had taught him. Laughter bubbled up from the young ones as they tried to dance, their parents watching with approval instead of suspicion. The afternoon passed in peaceful fellowship, so different from those early days of whispers and cold shoulders. As shadows lengthened, the family headed home to their sturdy ranch house, where lamplight soon glowed in welcome through spotless windows. In the parlor that evening, Mary Beth sat beside Gideon on their worn sofa, watching the last rays of sunset paint the valley gold. The room held comfortable silence, broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of cattle. "Do you remember," Mary Beth said softly, her hand finding Gideon's, "that day you made your condition? You asked me to take in a boy." She turned to meet his gaze, her eyes bright with meaning. "I think God asked me to take in two." Gideon's weathered face softened at her words. The poor mountain man who had once stood awkward and ashamed at the back of church now sat confident in his role as husband and father. His smile held all the warmth of spring as he drew her close. Outside their window, stars began to appear over the secure valley, bright points of light blessing the land that was now undeniably theirs. The evening air carried the scent of blooming lilacs from Mary Beth's garden, sweet promise of seasons to come. Their home stood as testament to faith rewarded, love proven, and family restored, not just by paper and law, but by the deeper bonds of hearts chosen and cherished. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.